Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Democratic View, and I am the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and with me today is a man I have been working with for almost a year, and he is a paisano. His name is Joseph Giannini, the host of the East End Veteran Show. Welcome, Joe.
Oh, thank you.
So I would like people to know a little bit about who you are and where you come from. So give us an idea about where you were born and raised.
All right. I was born in 1943 in Kings County Hospital. At the time, my dad was in the Army. He was out in Fort Sill. He was being trained to be a tanker, but actually he was dying from an infection in his brain. My mom was working for the federal government back here in Brooklyn, back in Brooklyn.
Yes, some people don't know that Kings County is Brooklyn.
Yeah. And actually she told me, and he told me that he was really dying. And they sent her a telegram from Fort Sill to come there as soon as possible. But her father would not let her go because she was pregnant with me, and he said it's better to lose one than two. So my dad made it through, and he never made it overseas because he was so ill here. I mean, he was really, they gave him his last rites. Someday I'll show you some photos of him. He had a terrible infection in the brain that took many months and many surgeries to get it out, and he survived it. I mean, strong guy.
So you were raised in Brooklyn?
What happened is my dad moved us out of Brooklyn when I was about 6 or 7. He moved us out to the island. His idea was that me and my sister would have a better chance out on the island, you know, going to school, high school and college, and he was right.
Where on the island? It's a big island.
We moved out to Plainview when I was about 6. And so I was raised on the island. I graduated from Massapequa High School in 1961, and I went on to Hofstra University, and I was a poli-sci major. I wrestled on a scholarship. I played some football in high school. I worked out, and then I went right from Hofstra University into the Marine Corps in I joined the Marine Corps in 1966.
You joined?
Yes.
You weren't drafted?
I was being drafted, and at the last moment I decided I wanted to go in the Marine Corps because of two things. Because I thought I was going to Vietnam, and I had a better chance of surviving with the Marines, and Marines were around water and I could surf. So I joined the Marine Corps.
Oh, so you mean that's why you're a born surfer, because
you
were always on the island.
I've been surfing since I'm 18 years old, which is a little late, but yes, I was always around the water. In my teens, yes. The other thing is, so I went in the Marine Corps, and I went in as an enlisted man, and went to Paris Island. But while I was at Paris Island, they came around and they pulled a few of us out. I was a college grad already. I was the only college grad in my platoon at Paris Island. And they said I could apply for OCS, which I did. So I did.
Officers Candidate School.
Yeah, so I was an enlisted Marine for a little while. I made PFC, I was very proud of that. And then I went on to OCS, and I made it through that. And I wound up, going from a private to a captain, and doing, a tour in Vietnam as a young, very young man, but probably one of the oldest people in my platoon, 24.
Oh, God.
Did I give you enough background? Oh, and then it was only when I was back home from Nam and in the Marine Corps I decided to go to law school. And I did. I went to law school after I got out of the Marine Corps.
And what law school?
I went to Brooklyn Law, which was a very good school,
Or it
still
is a very good school. Has quite a good
And
reputation.
I wound up doing exactly what I wanted to do, you know, a criminal defense, which I've been doing for a long, long time. So,
Yes. And as a matter of fact, you, as a Vietnam vet, started that, or was part of the group of people that started the show, East End Veterans, which we see here.
Right.
And which I now am a member of, that, although I always have to introduce myself as not being a veteran, except of schools.
Right.
But you have been doing that show, and who did you start it with, and how long have you been doing it?
We started, I think, 8 years. We started back in 2004 with Ed Gorman, Ed Statement, Mike O'Shea, Bill Taylor, Jim Schwartz. Oh my God. Who else? Len Green. That was the core. There were many other people involved. We started out, we called ourselves Veterans for Kerry. We came together to counteract the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth that we thought were, you know, really slandering him, defaming him, or slandering him. And Mike O'Shea said, let's do a show at LTV. And we did a show before the election in 2004, and we've never stopped. And we really got involved in a lot of political activities against the war in Iraq, and finally the war in Afghanistan. What else? And of course, we've always championed, the veterans. They're coming home and getting them the proper treatment. We've always talked about that.
Yes, because I want to explain to people that I always felt, as an ordinary American, like most people who are watching, that war is something we never had any experience with. War was something that I always tell you was over there.
Right.
It was something that John Wayne did. It was something that was in the movies. I never really experienced war until I knew you guys at the show. And by the way, I was married to two veterans. I've had a few marriages, so I was married. Two of them were veterans.
Were they combat vets?
No. Well, one was sort of, because he was in Guam, and he did see a little bit of action but he was also in the Air Force as a rear gunner. So you don't ever see anybody face to face. It's not quite like being in combat on the ground, like you were. And one of the things we have talked so much about, which you guys have really brought home to me, is the silent wounds of war and how it affects the minds of those who do combat.
I first heard that term, we call invisible wounds, not too long ago, believe it or not, from another Vietnam vet. We were part of a Vietnam exhibit at the Brooklyn Historical Society. We had been picked out of hundreds for this show, and he's the first one that told me, look at me, do I look okay? I said, yes. He says, but I have invisible wounds. And I was like, oh my God, what does that mean? That's before I would admit, that, everybody that goes into combat, they wind up with some type of, invisible wounds, some worse than others, some so bad they can't live with it and they kill themselves. And that's going on quite often right now.
Yes, we have seen a lot of that in this last combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, but there always were. They always had different names. It was shell shock, is what they called it. Or there were people who did experience, even in World War II, these kinds of traumatic experiences that left them scarred emotionally and psychologically, and they never talked about it.
No.
I remember reading about some guy in Long Island who died not too long ago, and he had journals that he kept with all of his experiences, but they were things he never spoke to his family about. They never knew how he was suffering from the combat of World War II that he had experienced. So it is something that happens with people who have been in combat. And so that's one of the things I have come away from your show, knowing more about than most people do. I think most people, and particularly in the last two wars where we never were, we know in Iraq, when the bodies came home in the coffins, they weren't even allowed to photograph them. We never even saw them. The Bush administration didn't allow that kind of thing.
Yeah, do we still have a little bit of time?
Sure, we have lots.
I want to tell you something about these invisible wounds. I've told this story before. The first time I cried in Vietnam, I only cried, I think, 3 times. And I never cried because I was frightened. I cried because I guess I saw other people suffering, and it affected me. But the first time I cried is I had been in the rear, I don't know, for a night at the Quang Tri Combat Base, and somehow I sat down, and we didn't have many chairs, but we sat down outside, and I drank. I was drinking with these enlisted Marines, which, officers are not supposed to do that. So I was drinking with them, and they all were hardened combat vets that had survived for a while. And they started talking about what they saw, what they did, what they heard, and And this went on all night until every one of them, they all passed out, and I woke up I probably woke up like about maybe 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. It was pitch black, a lot of stars, and I looked over at them, and I just knew that they would never get over what had happened to them, and I just started crying because they were so young, and I knew that the future was going to be really tough. I knew then that something bad was going to come of this, and I didn't know anything about post-traumatic stress or combat fatigue, or
Right.
I didn't know anything about that.
Any of those
but I
names,
knew something
those
bad.
euphemisms that they give to the
Yeah.
destruction that happens to a person
Yeah.
when they have killed other people.
And they watched their good friends die in front
Right.
of them, get killed.
Yes, and that's the other part of it. It isn't just only who you kill.
So-
It's also, the fact that you lose some people.
And if they made it out, these Marines, probably most of them that's with me that night that were drinking with me, we were drinking some type of bourbon.
I wonder where you got that in Vietnam.
It was hard to get it, believe me. It was hard. We didn't drink too often. But remember, if they made it out, then they probably, there was 5 of them maybe 2 of them were killed and 2 were seriously wounded. That's what was happening. But if they made it out when they came home, it wasn't going to be a good homecoming.
Well, it wasn't a good homecoming for anybody in Vietnam. It was something that now that we know, we all can look back, Americans who are alive and adults at that time can look back and realize what a wrong we committed against the people in Vietnam. We blamed you guys for the war we didn't like. Now, the difference between Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan is that you guys were drafted, and so it was from the main population that people were drafted. So everybody knew somebody who was being, and Iraq and Afghanistan are all volunteer armies. Yeah. So it's really over there. It's really something you don't get to know. And therefore we never had any of the real movement against the wars. I mean, there were many people who questioned whether we should have ever gone into Iraq, including.
The big lesson that we've learned is, yes, you separate the soldier from the war. We didn't do that during Vietnam. The other thing is this, we accept it now that a lot of these young men and women will have this post-traumatic stress disorder. They don't like that word disorder, but they will be affected by, by going to war. And when they come home, we really want to help them. Not that we can all the time, not that we can, but we really want to help them. A lot of them are beyond help, and a lot of them are going to be mistreated for different reasons. And I see that happen all the time. I'm dealing with it right now. I kept bringing up this young vet's name, Joseph Lorenzo, who's being held without bail because they just don't understand what's going on with him, and they don't understand enough about him. He's a textbook case of what can go wrong. It could get worse. I mean, some of them have been mistreated, like he's being mistreated, and they'll kill themselves in jail or when they come out of jail, or So it's really an epidemic of suicide and post-traumatic stress. But at least this time we're trying. But a lot of times it's not working.
Well, it's true. We do understand it a bit more.
Yes.
And there are programs to help. And I know that the Veterans Administration, which has that new guy who's head of it, whose name I can never pronounce, the Japanese American.
Shinseki.
Yeah, who is now head of the VA. And I know the VA has really got backlogged with cases of people who need help, who have suffered a great deal because of their war experiences. I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that Joe is also a writer, and I have read many of his stories, and this was one that appeared in the Star, not this week, but the week before. It's called Reliable, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story about an experience he has where he sees this young Viet Cong.
Oh, actually, North Vietnamese.
North Vietnamese.
Yeah, Army.
It's not the same as Viet Cong?
No. The distinction is when I say North Vietnamese, NVA, North Vietnamese Army, he's actually a member of a regular army. Viet Cong is a guerrilla. They're guerrilla units.
Oh.
In Vietnam, there were always two wars going on at the same time. There was a guerrilla war where we fought the Viet Cong, and then we also were fighting regular units of the North Vietnamese Army, which they had uniforms and helmets, and this guy was North Vietnamese Army regular that we came across.
So tell us that story quickly, because it's a wonderful little story. Well, you come upon him and
we were out on a combat patrol. It was during the monsoons. It was raining very hard. It was windy. It was cold. We were walking along in rice paddies that are halfway up to our knees, muddy. And first of all, I recovered I think it was his AK-47 by stepping on it in a rice paddy and thinking I had stepped on a mine. And I was standing on it and thinking that this might be the end.
Yes.
And
boy, that must be a moment of truth.
It was horrible. But I realized that after standing on this metallic object for a while, that I was standing on an AK-47 in the muddy water. I couldn't see it. But then as we moved on, not too long after that, we found him in the corner of a rice paddy. He was trying to hide, but he had put up a little lean-to because it was raining, and he was really wounded pretty bad. I could see he was bleeding through his green utility shirt. Blood was flowing out into the rice paddy. And I almost killed him. I almost executed him, but I decided to do something worse, to leave him there and let him die.
He lifted his hand like that to you.
But something, I didn't care about that. I wasn't showing any mercy. I decided to let him, die miserably. We weren't going to carry him. I wasn't going to do that. So I decided to let him die in the rain. That's how inhumane we were. But as we walk on, I do laugh a little bit when I see one of the Marines falling down over and over in the rain and the mud. But then, we move on and we take over a village, and we stay. And on the way in, I noticed that some of the villages are hurt, and I know that we had done it, with our artillery, with our mortars. And they were women, they were children and women, and I actually medevaced them out to a field hospital, which, so one moment I could be deadly, and the next moment I could be humane. That's the way it was. And you never know when you're going to do that. But we stayed in the village a little too long, and the sun actually came out, and the villagers brought me a young man on a stretcher, and it was the young North Vietnamese Army guy that I had left to die. He had survived in the rain for 3 days. And I decided, 3 days in the rain.
Wow.
And he was still alive. And I decided at that point I wouldn't kill him. And I medevaced him out. Got him a priority medevac. But after
Too bad you didn't get his name. You could look him up and see whatever happened to him. Who knows who he could have become.
They might have got killed in the rear because
Yeah.
they were, there was what we call now harsh interrogation. They were torturing, we knew that. They were torturing the Viet Cong. They were torturing the North Vietnamese Army regulars. They were torturing innocent people. We knew this was going on. So I don't know what happened to him. But I couldn't kill him.
Well, I mean, it's one of those stories, I think, that illustrates something that you have talked about to me personally, which is about the conflict of feelings
Yes.
that one has when one is in combat, or at least you did in Vietnam, which is that you, on one hand, could be quite cruel.
Yes.
And on another hand, you could be quite
Humane.
So that's an amazing thing. And the other thing I always I think that has impressed me a great deal working with the East End veterans, who are mostly veterans from Vietnam. I think a couple are from Korea, and one is Ed is from World War II. But it seems as though Vietnam has become such an incredible, definitive war in the history of this country. I mean, now we have a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense who are both Vietnam vets.
And the head of the VA. Oh, no, he's a World War II. Oh, what is he? I think he's a Vietnam vet, too.
I think he is, too.
Yeah.
And so that means that there are people who are in the government now who went through what you went through, who know the seriousness of war and how it affects people, and that maybe you have to think a little bit more before you take steps into actual combat.
Do we have a minute or two?
You do.
Let's see, when did I went to see this young vet that's incarcerated right now. I went to see him, was it Monday I went to see him? Yeah, I went to see him Monday. And we were talking about, his service. He was in the first Gulf War. And he said something to me that really helps you. He says, we had to learn to turn on a dime. And I knew exactly what he meant. That things were happening. And if you couldn't turn your back on it and walk away from it, you wouldn't survive. You had to turn on a dime away from horrible things, horrible sounds, horrible thoughts, and get on with it. Because if you didn't turn on a dime, you wouldn't survive. That's what you have to do in combat. Turn on a dime and move on. Suppress everything that you just saw and heard and that you did, and move on. That's what takes, you don't realize until later on what you've done. But that's one of the survival things.
I don't know if I could have survived being in combat. Thank God. Thank God. I bless myself every once in a while, and grateful that I never experienced anything like that, nor has my son, or even the father of my children, who was in Korea but spent it in Paris. So he never experienced combat either. But to experience combat is quite an emotional, physical, and psychological trauma to any human being. And that's what people don't know. And that's what, you mentioned the first Gulf War. Good God, whoever even thinks about the first Gulf War anymore, when we hear about Iraq and Afghanistan all the time. But the first Gulf War, that's like...
That was in 1990, I think.
Yes.
And the effects of that war are still being felt on the veterans like this young veteran that, I call him young, he's 42. Something went wrong. And he's not, I'm hoping that this particular vet, Joseph Lorenzo, is going to be, he's going to get through it with my help, and he's going to get on with his life. But it really is a fight. We're in a fight.
Yes. Well, I think when you've been in the fights you've been in, it makes you a very tough lawyer. So if I ever commit a crime, I'm going to call you. Anyway, Joe, thank you so much for coming today.
It's a pleasure.
And by the way, folks, you can see this on YouTube in a little while, and also take a look at our website called the ehdems.org. See you in another week. Thank you so much for coming.
We